process. And of course, what the ideal interview process is going to vary a little bit per organization and even per role within your organization. So it can look a little bit different depending on the type of role and the company. And if you're interested in working together to get a more clearly defined specific process for your organization, you are welcome to schedule a call on my calendar and we can talk about potentially working together to see if I can help. However, I'm going to share with you some basics in this module that should help you get yourself started and on the right track to creating a successful interview process. And I do think that the steps that I'll share with you, these basic steps, can apply across all industries. And I'll share an example. So of course, I recruit specifically for the medical industry, medical manufacturing companies, so pharma, biotech, med device, diagnostics. So a lot of sales roles, but also marketing, medical affairs, market access. However, I was working with a career coaching client who was in the construction business. And since I'm a recruiter, he, as well as a coach, he was asking me about, or sharing with me, some challenges that his company was having with turnover in their interview process. And I asked him, well, what's the process? And it was just 2 steps. So I identified a problem right there. So even though the construction industry is an industry that I have not recruited for, I was able to quickly identify, well, there's one problem. You don't have enough steps in the interview process. And that's where we want to start. So first, I'm going to jump in with some do's and some don'ts for the ideal interview process. And the first do is do have multiple steps in the process. And I recommend ideally having 4 to 5 interview steps minimum. 4 to 5 is a good amount. So 4 to 5, strive for that. And you can move things around, you can combine steps, but you don't want to eliminate steps altogether. You do want to create opportunities for the employee to have, or I'm sorry, for the candidate to have multiple touch points with different employees at the company throughout the interview process. This is going to help them get a sense of the company culture and learn how they feel, if it feels like a right fit. And the interview process is just as much for the candidate as it is for the hiring manager. So these additional steps and touch points can either just as they can build your confidence in this candidate's candidacy, they can also build the candidate's confidence, or vice versa. We can learn, oh, this is not a good fit, let me take myself out of the running. And of course, hiring managers can do the same. All right, so that's the first do. You want to have multiple steps in the interview process, at least 4 to 5. And this is giving the candidate an opportunity to have multiple touch points with different employees in the company. And that includes yourself, the hiring manager, other employees on your team that are maybe in the same role. So this way they can learn about the day in the life and the challenges and the opportunities and better understand if they're going to like it, if they're going to be able to bring value. And also have additional members of your leadership team, other managers, participate in the hiring process as well, because each of us thinks differently. So we're going to pick up and notice different things and have different potential concerns or red flags. And so if you have these multiple viewpoints coming together, then you can better qualify a candidate and have more confidence in your decision. Now, another do that I highly recommend in every interview process is to give your candidate an assignment. This is going to require them to take action to demonstrate their vested interest, and it could be something that they're going to need to do on the job or be able to do on the job, so you can assess their skill set. So whatever that assignment is going to look like, that's going to depend on you and your company and the role and what you're looking for. And maybe it's specific to that particular candidate, but definitely I recommend do give candidates an assignment at some point throughout the interview process, and you can even give them more than one. Another do that I highly recommend is to follow the golden rule during the interview process. Treat the candidate as you yourself would like to be treated. And I'll give you an example. So you want to be considering the candidate, even though you, the hiring manager, are busy doing multiple tasks, juggling multiple meetings, putting out fires, you've got your team to manage, you've got this open territory maybe to manage, you are busy. However, you want to remember that the candidate you want is also busy. They're likely prioritizing their current role. And by showing them that you value their time and you respect their time and appreciate their time, and just treat them the way that you would like to be treated, is going to give them a good feeling in coming to work for you. Whereas if they're not feeling this throughout the process, they may decide, you know what, doesn't actually feel like the right fit for me. So just a couple of examples of how you can follow the golden rule in ways and examples of times that you may not be thinking about it. This will hopefully give you some awareness around how you can can better treat candidates how you would like to be treated during the interview process. So one example is to give them multiple time and date options for interviews. So we don't always have that luxury. A lot of times your schedules are crunched, but whenever possible, as much as possible, give them at least 3 different time and date options to schedule that interview with you, because they have their own schedule to manage too. And another example would be making sure that you get their important questions answered. And that sounds obvious, but sometimes candidates go through the interview process and they don't get some of their important questions answered. And what happens is they don't have a clear picture of the important things that they need to know about the role and the company, and whatever other details that are important to them before taking the opportunity. And then maybe they go against their judgment and they go ahead and accept the position anyway. But then this could result in turnover because they later learn, you know what, this is not what I thought it was going to be. So you want to be transparent and forthcoming with the good and the bad, and then they can better assess if it's going to be a fit for them. And that's going to save you time during the interview process as well. So make sure that you're valuing and respecting your candidate, treating them like you would want to be treated, and just as you would want your important questions answered. Make sure that you're giving them time and taking time throughout the process to understand and answer their questions. Another do that I highly recommend during the interview process is to be adaptable. Keep the momentum during the interview process. So no news is not good news. And when we have long lengths of time in between interview steps and there's no feedback for the candidate, they don't know what's happening, they are more likely to focus their attention elsewhere. And this is where you can have your star candidates falling out of the process. So I mentioned before that it's okay to combine steps, maybe move interview steps around. Maybe one member of the leadership team that is supposed to participate in the interview process is not available that week. You could either move that interview step to another time, or you could see if there's a different manager on the leadership team that could participate. And then sometimes, let's say you're running into crunch time, you really want to get this candidate, but you've got a couple more steps, and again, you don't want to skip steps, you can combine steps. So maybe there's 2 more steps for the candidate to complete, where they're going to meet with this hiring manager and this hiring manager, for example. Instead of meeting for 2 different meetings, you do a panel interview and just do an interview together and knock out 2 steps in 1 step. But this way you're still creating that touch point with both of those members of the leadership team. So you're technically not eliminating any of the steps. So be adaptable, keep the momentum. If there are delays in the process, or there are going to be upcoming delays in the process, communicate. This goes back to the golden rule again. You value yourself, I'm sure, as a hiring manager, you value your time. And if you're not getting feedback and attention from a company that you're interviewing with, you're likely going to take your valuable time and attention and focus it elsewhere. And the candidates that you want are going to do the same thing because they value and prioritize themselves. So do create multiple steps in the interview process. Do create multiple touch points with different members of the team and the leadership team. Do give your candidates an assignment, at least one. You can even give them multiple assignments throughout the interview process. Do follow the golden rule, treat candidates like you would want to be treated, and do be adaptable as needed and keep the momentum. All right, now let's dive in and look at the actual process, starting with when do you start the interview process. I highly recommend starting the interview process when you get your first good resume. Now, understandably, sometimes hiring managers want to wait until they have a good pool of candidates and resumes to compare and then start the process. But here's what happens. In a competitive candidates market, which it is, and for some reason it has been increasingly so for years now. So whenever I first started recruiting, I think I mentioned this in an earlier video, I could reach out to maybe 150 candidates and get a good solid pool of 6 to 8 qualified candidates to present. That is not the case anymore. I'm reaching out to more and more and more, sometimes double, sometimes triple, often double, sometimes triple the amount of candidates to get half the amount of qualified candidates to present. So what this means is it is a candidates market. They are coveted. They know that they have multiple opportunities. And so when you get a good resume, that is when you want to go ahead and interview that candidate. Now, sometimes you definitely want to leave an opening open until you find the right candidate. And I'm sharing that to say that it's not often, but sometimes when I present that first resume, I know this is a solid candidate, and I'm going to still keep working to present more candidates because that's my job. But that candidate is the candidate and they get the job. So you don't necessarily need to or want to wait until you have 5 to 10 quality resumes. You may not get that, and you might lose out on that first candidate who could be your candidate. They could be really strong. So when you get that first solid resume, and I have some hiring managers that I work with that are really great at this, they get that resume, they say this looks great, I want to go ahead and schedule an interview. That's what you want to do. Start the process as soon as you get your first good resume, and then keep the process moving. Now, one thing to keep in mind during the interview process is, just like a sales process, if you are a sales leader, the interview process is a process that builds. Like dating, I often like to say that the interview process should be like dating, meaning that the amount of time that you invest in the candidate and that they invest in you and in preparing for each interview step and researching the company and the competitors and all of that is going to gradually build. And it could be not necessarily gradual, but the point is it's going to build with each interview step in the process, provided that it is a good fit. So for example, you don't want, and you want to align your interview steps as such, where you create an opportunity for the investment to build. So you don't want to, for example, have a first interview where the candidate is coming and they're traveling 2 hours to an in-person interview, and they're supposed to come prepared with a business plan and a product demonstration. Now that is a totally exaggerated example, although I'm sure it's happened before. I know part of that scenario has happened before, and I was cringing as I was trying to prepare candidates for this initial interview where they were supposed to present a business plan for the first interview, and it just was not, it didn't align for that particular role. I might go more into detail about that later, but each step in the process should build. Now, for this reason, I highly recommend that the first interview be a phone interview, a 30-minute phone interview. Now, these days, a lot of managers like to do Zoom, and that can work too. I think people are now more comfortable with the Zoom, whereas before, years ago, it probably would have been a little bit more nerve-wracking. And just like dating, you're going to be more comfortable meeting the person if you've already talked on the phone and established some sort of rapport. So by having the first step in the interview process be a 30-minute phone interview, this is low pressure, this is low stakes. The candidate can take a little bit of time to prepare, but not a ton of time to prepare, as they should not be doing that anyway, because if they have their priorities straight, they don't yet know enough about this opportunity to know that they want to devote 2 hours of time prepping for the interview. And that could be more of a requirement or a need if they're preparing for an in-person interview. So by creating a process that builds and having that first step be a phone interview, the hiring manager and the candidate can establish some rapport, maybe some likability, and then if the candidate likes you and feels comfortable with you, they're going to be more invested to put more effort in the next interview step. And the same goes for you. You're then going to be more invested once you like this candidate, you've learned a little bit about them, you're going to be excited to maybe meet them in person for that next step in the interview process. And also a 30-minute phone interview, or if you want to do Zoom, but keeping it around 30 minutes, that's enough time to learn enough about the candidate and for them to learn enough about you and the role to both establish whether or not you would like to move forward. And then it doesn't take too much time away from your calendar, because if you have that first interview be, for example, a 45-minute Zoom interview or an hour Zoom interview, even if it's a 45-minute interview, that's your whole hour block. You're not going to get anything else done within that hour. And in an 8 or 10-hour workday, when you've got a lot of different tasks to do, especially if you're interviewing multiple candidates in addition to your other things that are tasks in your workload, this is a lot of time invested and potentially lost if it's with the wrong candidate. But if it's just a 30-minute phone interview or maybe Zoom, you haven't lost a lot of time. So I highly recommend the first interview be a phone or Zoom interview. Now, when you're moving into a second interview or the third interview, this is where the steps can be interchangeable a little bit, and you'll see what works for you. And it could change just depending on your availability. The important piece to remember is to keep the process moving. So let's say you have a 30-minute phone or Zoom interview with your candidate initially, and you decide that you want to move them forward, and ideally you would like for the next step to be for that candidate to meet with you in person for a 1-hour interview, but you've got vacation coming up, the candidate's available but you're not, for example. Rather than wait 2 weeks, go ahead and move, I recommend just moving the steps around. And so for the second interview, it could be a 1-hour in-person meeting with you, or if that works for your schedules and timeline, or you could have that candidate meet with another rep on your team for a coffee or a Zoom. So that next touch point, it can either be with yourself, it can be with somebody else on your team, one of your direct reports. That is always a great opportunity. I think it's really important for candidates to connect with folks on the team to learn more about day in the life, because if they learn, oh, you know what, this is not actually what I'm looking for, they can go ahead and weed themselves out without taking up more time on your calendar. So this is definitely a good step in the interview process. And something else you could do for the first interview, 30-minute phone or Zoom, and then you could have the candidate reach out to some folks on the team. This is a good either second or third step in the interview process. You could give them an assignment to proactively, so they initiate contact with 2 to 3 folks on your team. They prepare some questions, learn about the role, and then they have an activity to do, an assignment to follow back up with you via email or phone and share what they have learned about the opportunity. This gives them an opportunity to demonstrate their vested interest, because they have to take an action to move forward in the next step. And then this gives the candidate additional touch points with 2 or 3 other people from the company. And then if it is a good fit, the more touch points that they have, their confidence in the role being the right fit for them is going to increase, and they're going to be more invested in the process. So that could be a good step, just depending on, again, you can interchange these steps, whatever works, and it could be different for each candidate, each process, just depending on what your schedule looks like and what everybody else's schedule looks like. But you could have you could meet with a candidate in person for a second interview, or you could save that for the third interview. Definitely somewhere in the process, implement that step, I think, sooner rather than later, of having the candidate reach out to other folks on the team. And also for a second and or third interview, you could have the candidate connect with another manager, so another member of your leadership team. So maybe the ideal process looks like, okay, 30-minute phone or Zoom interview with you, the hiring manager, then in-person phone or Zoom interview with you, the hiring manager, then proactively reaching out, connecting with 2 to 3 folks on the team and following back up with you, then maybe a Zoom or phone interview with another member of the leadership team. Then maybe the 5th step is you give them an assignment to complete and present at the panel interview with yourself and 2 other members of the leadership team. Or maybe the assignment is something different throughout the process, and that final step could be with executive leadership, so your boss or your boss's boss. It just depends on the role. Typically for the higher level role, the candidate's going to interview with maybe the VP of the division, something like that. So those would be some ideal steps in the interview process. 5 steps, multiple touch points with different folks from the company, and multiple touch points with you, the hiring manager. Now let's talk about some examples of assignments that you can give to the candidate. So I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. One interview that I did, it was for a pharma sales position when I was first moving to New York. They had me analyze data during the interview. So I had a phone interview, and then I flew out for an in-person interview. I don't remember all of the steps there. But we had an in-person conversation, and then they gave me some time alone in the room by myself to complete this assignment. And it was interpreting data and aligning how I would, I think, schedule my week, how I would prioritize the target customers. And that was a good assignment, because this is something that I was going to need to be doing in my day-to-day dynamics of the role. And so they wanted to see if this was something that I was able to do. So that's one example. You could give them an assignment during the panel interview. That was a panel interview because I met with 2 different managers. You could give them a little bit of information, or ask them to gather information from the website and do a product demonstration. You could ask them to do a 30, 60, 90-day business plan. You could ask them to do what I call a why me presentation. Now you could have, and I think that this is a good thing to do, one specific assignment that is established at the start of the interview process that every candidate is going to do, and then you can give that assignment the information needed to the recruiter. So this way the recruiter knows how to explain to the candidate, this is what they're looking for, and here's the information that you need to deliver this assignment. And then that takes that task off of your plate, where you, the hiring manager, are not having to go through and take time, 30 minutes, 20 minutes on the phone with the candidate explaining to them what you're looking for. You can give that information, prepare it up front, decide across the company, the division, this is the assignment that we're going to give in this for this role for every interview process, and then it's established, it's done. You communicate that one time to your recruiter, and then they can communicate that moving forward for that role for each candidate. That's going to save you a ton of time. So I highly recommend that. Pick one assignment. You can get with your leadership team, brainstorm on what that assignment, what's going to make the most sense for that assignment for your candidates. Now, when you can give another assignment is when you have potential red flag concern with a candidate. You can create a specific assignment to address that concern, and you don't have to let the candidate know that that's an additional step in the interview process. They can just think that that's part of the process. And I'll give you an example. I can think of a couple times, probably many more times, but two that really jump out at me, where the leadership team was really hyped about these candidates. They really liked them. And I was thinking, why do you like these candidates? I was seeing some red flags. So my red flag, even though they were my candidates, there's a process for a reason, so that our confidence increases or it decreases, and then we know which direction to go. Move forward with this candidate, move away from this candidate. My hesitation with these candidates was that they were acting very excited about the role, but they were not able to put into words why. So for me, the genuine box was not checked. So if I were the hiring manager and I felt like, okay, well, I like their background, I like their context, I like their enthusiasm and effort in the process, but they're not able to tell me why they really want this role. Since I need to understand this to feel confident in moving them forward, I'm going to ask them to create a why me presentation. Why me for you, and why the company for me. Put together a 10-minute presentation with a slide deck, and you're going to present that at the final panel interview. And this will address that concern. They will either overcome it or they will bomb. And while it might hurt to lose that candidate initially, it will hurt much less than if you had made a bad hire, lost all of that time and money that you invested and the company invested, and then you're having to start all over again. So recapping, I recommend thinking of one assignment across the board that's established for each role, for each candidate moving forward, and for as long as that works. And then if you can implement other assignments as needed. And then again, having the candidate proactively reach out to other folks on the team, that's an assignment too, but that should be, I highly recommend to have that be a step in the interview process, because having those low pressure conversations with other folks on the team is going to give the candidate a clearer picture of what their day in the life is going to look like, what challenges they're going to be up against, what the culture is like. It's going to give them a feel firsthand for the sense of the culture, because they're talking with other people that they're going to be working with. All right, so recapping, have at least 4 to 5 interview steps, create multiple touch points with different folks from the company, including members of your team of direct reports. Create assignments, keep the process moving, and have different types of interviews. Definitely meet them in person if you can. Have a combination of phone, Zoom, in person, and with different folks at the company. Panel interviews are fine and a good idea to combine steps that way if needed, and have your candidate connect with different folks on the team. All right, circling back to some don'ts. We talked about do's, now let's talk about don'ts. Don't rush the process. So again, you can combine steps as needed, you can move things around, but do not eliminate steps altogether, because each interview step in the process is important. And it's going to create that needed touch point that is just as important for the candidate as it is for you. Because even if you think, I really want this candidate, guess what? If the candidate feels like it's not a potential fit, but they move forward anyway, well, whatever is not a fit today is not going to be a fit a year from now, and then this can result in turnover. So don't rush the process. And I'll give you an example. I was working on an opening, and there were problems with this search because it was dragging out way too long, a year. I'm not exaggerating at all when I say 1 year. It was either 11 or 12 months, definitely at least 11 months. So this was too long. So there was a problem. So we had to go back and fix some things, like the travel was high, the comp was low. It was an associate level position, so career up and comers that are going to be more open-minded, which sounds like it would be easier to fill these kinds of roles, but it's actually not, because when we know what we want, we get there faster. So it's actually easier to fill higher level roles, I find, because I'm dealing with candidates that know exactly what they want, versus a candidate that's more open, that's not sure what they want, so they're going to be entertaining multiple opportunities. Or they might start to move forward in the process and then later back out because they learn, oh, this actually, I don't think that this is, what I want. So we had a solid candidate and she really wanted the opportunity, but the process was dragging out because they had a very small leadership team and they had multiple steps in the interview process. They had a really solid process, complete with having the candidate connect with different folks on the team, different reps, and with every manager on the leadership team. There were 5, and a panel interview and an assignment with a presentation. So all great steps. This candidate really wanted this opportunity, but she was also interviewing, and I think she had an offer or was at final stages with another opportunity that was less travel and more money. But because of all of those touch points that she'd had with this company, she really felt good with the culture and the product, and she wanted to work for this company. But the timeline was not working out. So this director, no, actually, he was a VP of sales, so high level, and the best leaders are the busiest, yet still somehow manage to give the most time. They manage their time by spending it, investing it well, but they do give it. So he called me and said, okay, we've got a problem. I'm trying to work this out. We want to get her to the final interview. So what I would like to do is see if we can combine 2 interview steps. And that's what we did. And she completed that interview, and instead of having 2 additional steps, she had 1, but nothing was really eliminated because instead of 2 interviews with 2 separate managers, they participated together on the panel interview, and she got the job. So that's just an example of keeping the momentum, keeping the process moving, and adapting as needed. Another don't is I do not recommend asking the candidate to travel far for a first interview. 1, if they are open and willing to do this, how much do you think they're prioritizing their current role, obligations, and responsibilities? 2, they may not value themselves and truly understand their worth. So there may be some challenges around self and social awareness, and also direction, understanding what they really want and knowing that they can achieve it, confidence. If a candidate is willing to just drop everything and fly, for a first or a second interview, I think there are some flags there. And it sounds kind of crazy, like this wouldn't happen, but I've had this happen multiple times where that is part of the interview process, where either they'll have maybe a 30-minute phone interview, and then next, Amy will get these candidates to another state for in-person interviews on this day. And I'm like cringing because I know that these candidates don't have enough information yet to know if that's going to be a good use of their time. They're not invested enough in the opportunity, nor should they be. I also do not recommend requesting a business plan for a first or a second interview. A second interview might be okay, depending on the level of the role. If this is a high-level role where the candidate has put together business plans before and they're tenured and they know the lay of the land and the scope of the space, and maybe they have contacts and all of that, then it can maybe be okay. So while these tips are general, and I think that they do apply in most cases, of course, you can tweak yours depending on what's going to be right for you. But most of the time, I do not recommend having a candidate prepare a business plan for a second interview, definitely not for a first interview, because again, this goes back to the candidate that you want knows their value, and they are going to prioritize their time. So their job right now is their number 1 priority. They're still learning about your role, and again, the interview process is like dating, whereas the more they feel invested in the opportunity, the more time they're willing to invest, and then it makes sense to sit down and work for a couple hours on putting a business plan together. And another don't is don't let the communication lapse throughout the interview process. So things happen, things come up. If maybe the leadership team is on vacation, or there's a travel for a leadership meeting, something like that, let your recruiter know, so that at least let your recruiter know, or you can communicate with the candidate directly. But this is showing them that you value them, you appreciate them, you respect them and their time. Communicate what is going on. No news is not good news. And so if a candidate doesn't hear from the hiring manager or the recruiter, from the hiring manager or the recruiter for weeks, they are going to do what any high value person and candidate would do. They're going to give attention to what is giving them attention. And even if they weren't actively interviewing when they started the interview process with you, well, now they're more open to other opportunities. So I bet you good chances are that now they are looking. So if you let the communication lapse, maybe you have a candidate that you think is stronger than this other candidate that has completed more steps in the process, and you need this other candidate to catch up in the process, so you need some more time there. but anything could happen. Oftentimes their candidates are wild cards in the interview process. We extend an offer, they accept an offer, and then 2 weeks later they decide, no, I don't want to do this. I'm backing out. This happens more often than we would like. We never want this to happen, but it does happen. So if you have a solid candidate, you want to keep them warm. And how do you do that? With communication. So if there are going to be delays, that's okay, but communicate that to the candidate or to your recruiter so that they can communicate. Or another thing that you can do to keep the candidate engaged and warm is give them an additional touch point and assignment. You can add another step in the interview process just to keep them engaged. But what you don't want to do is let a lot of time go by without any communication, because then that strong candidate is likely going to fall out of the process. All right, a couple more do's. Do heed your instincts, heed your intuition during the hiring process. So when you're feeling good about the candidate, pay attention. That's a good thing. Of course, when you have a potential concern or red flag, pause, hesitation, gray area where you need more information, pay attention to that. Make a note, and maybe you don't want to put the candidate on the spot right then to dig deeper to figure out how if the candidate can overcome your concern, but don't forget about it. Make a mental note and make a physical note. Actually write it down, and then communicate your concern with other members of your leadership team or of your team of direct reports who are going to be participating in the interview process. Have them dig in and ask questions and keep an eye out for that potential concern during their time interviewing the candidate. Then again, reminder, another thing that you can do is you can create another step in the interview process to address your specific concern and see if the candidate can overcome your concern. Do set your candidates up for success by communicating, setting your expectations throughout the process. So, just as you would not come unprepared to a client meeting, why would your candidate come unprepared to a meeting? We don't necessarily need to throw the candidate off by giving them a surprise assignment. Give them an opportunity to prepare. Now, there are times where hiring managers will give the candidate an assignment, but they give them the information maybe a day before or 2 days before versus a week before, because they don't want them to have a lot of time to prepare. And that's okay too. Just give them enough information to set them up for success. Give them enough time. Let them know, set expectations with what you're looking for. And if you want them to do a presentation on your product, for example, let them know what you're looking for in the presentation. If you're not looking for them to be a product expert, let them know that. So that'll calm their nerves a little bit, and it'll help better set them up for success if they know what it is you're looking for. So communicate, set expectations to help set your candidates up throughout the process. Also, this is an important one, leverage your resources throughout the interview process. Sometimes I work with hiring managers. This happens more with newer hiring managers where they're not used to juggling all of the tasks of managing their leadership team. Now they're hiring, all of these things. It can understandably be quite stressful and overwhelming. And so I've seen what they will sometimes do is freeze up and just not start the process. And then this creates more stress because you've got your recruiters reaching out, because I'm going to keep reaching out and following up because I know, hey, I've got some strong candidates here. They're going to entertain other opportunities and fall out of the process. And all these hours of work that I put into searching and interviewing, it's going to be basically invested for nothing. And then I'm going to be starting the process over again. So you want to get the process started, but let's say you've got too much to balance and too much to manage. Leverage your resources. So other direct reports on your team or other members of your leadership team, maybe they can step in and do that first initial phone interview. Maybe a rep can meet the candidate for a coffee. Maybe they can have the phone conversation. But this way the candidate gets engaged and learns more. And then if it is a good potential fit, then they are invested. And then you are more invested because you already have good feedback from this candidate. So use your resources throughout the interview process to help you better manage the process and manage your time. And then a couple more don'ts. Don't ignore your instincts, and don't make assumptions. Well, I've got a potential concern here, but I think that I'll probably be able to work it out. This is an assumption. Don't make assumptions. Get your questions answered. This is part of heeding your instincts and just going deeper when you have that red flag. Pay attention to it and then take an action take a step in that direction. Take an action toward overcoming your instincts by not making an assumption and, for example, getting your important questions answered.